Hello friends, Namaste. Today's topic is to discuss on these 4-5 terms that we frequently use. Either we use them in our day-to-day mundane life, or we use them in science, or we use them in spirituality. And what are these words? These words are observer, observing, witnessing, mindfulness, consciousness, and awareness. Let us see what all these words do really mean in these three paradigms. One is into our daily mundane life, and into science, and into the world of spirituality. These two spheres, these two areas are very, very important for us. One is the area of science, which we can never ignore. Without science, we have to go to the dark ages again. So science uplifts us in everything outside, all sorts of conveniences. So it is transforming the whole world outside. And spirituality aims at transforming ourselves, our own being. So these are the two paradigms. So let us start first with science. Science uses this word called observer. So a scientist observes everything outside. So he has got this three-way approach. That suppose if a scientist observes a atomic world, then he has these three things. One is that he himself as an observer. Then he will have some kind of an observing equipment. And the third thing that he has is that something that he is observing. So the observed thing. So there is an observer, there is an observing mechanism, an apparatus, and an observed thing. Let us take an example. Let's say if the scientist observes something very micro, let us say a microorganism, then he is an observer and he takes the help of a microscope and he observes that microscopic life, right? Or let's say if the scientist observes a star or a galaxy or a planet, he takes the help of a telescope and he observes that observed thing as an observer. So there are these three things: an observer, a observing thing, and the observed thing, and something that is used to observe that phenomena or that event, and equipment. This is part of the writings of Fritjof Capra, where he wrote various books on the science and spirituality parallels. And also this is part of the Copenhagen interpretation, that the observer has to be far away from the observed thing in order to bring in accurate results. Of course, apart from being the precision of the equipments being used to observe that phenomenon. But the observer has to keep himself far away from the phenomenon in order to bring in accurate results. So the theory says that they keep a distance of, they keep an infinite distance. So there is an infinite distance between the observer and the observed thing. So I really do not know how do they do it, but the theory says that they create this distance of infinite distance with the help of mathematics. So the point here is that the observer and the observed thing, there is a distance of, there's an infinite distance to bring out accurate results. So observer is the word that is being used by the scientists. So it is more used in science and not in spirituality. So when this word moves to spirituality, from observer it becomes a witness, right? So there is something called watchfulness. So we watch people outside, we watch things outside, but when we watch ourselves, when we observe ourselves at three levels: at the level of the actions of a body, and at the level of our feelings, and at the level of our thinking. The term that we use the term as witness. We don't use the term an observer. We don't use the word a watcher. So witnessing is more related to the individual universe. So when we observe ourselves at these three levels, right? So that is the fundamental difference between an observer and a witness. So to observer is to observe outside things. So it is more objective in nature. Witnessing is more subjective in nature because it relates to that particular individual. So he witnesses himself at these three levels, right? And what is mindfulness? Mindfulness is a method to witness oneself. Before going to mindfulness, let us first understand what consciousness means. We are either unconscious at some point, and we are sometimes conscious. Sometimes we may be doing some activity, and we may be doing it mechanically. We may be doing it just robotically, and we really do not know at that activity what we are doing. So we may be unconscious while doing some activity. And when we bring in consciousness, alertness, while doing that activity becomes a conscious activity. So we have an idea of what we are doing. We all have some time or the other in our life, we might have come across of this kind of situations that we lock our house and go out. Maybe after coming out, maybe after a minute, it hits our mind that probably we have not locked our house. Now, why this normally happens? Because while doing that activity of locking the door, we have not brought in consciousness. So there is something called a mechanical mind, a robotic mind, and that mind is trained every day while doing an activity. That mechanical mind, that robotic mind is trained, and it automatically takes over while doing those activities. So the subconscious mind does all those activities, and if the consciousness is not present, we forget what we have done. And after some time, we get this feeling, we forget, we might think that no, I might not have done this activity. So these are the three things which are there. That is consciousness, where we are alert, and unconsciousness, where we are not alert, we are absent. The awareness is absent, the consciousness is absent. And there is something called a subconscious level, which is more a mechanical part of the brain, a mechanical part of the mind, the one that does the mechanical activity without bringing in consciousness in that activity, right? So Mandukya Upanishad uses 4 kinds of consciousness. It talks about the consciousness of a waking body, that is when we are wakeful, when we are doing various kinds of things. The kind of consciousness that we have, that is when I touch something, when I do something, and when I am aware of whatever that I am doing, that waking consciousness is one consciousness. And there is something called the dreaming consciousness. So there is a dreaming body. So all activities that are happening in the dream, we normally think, we really think that all that is happening is a real thing. So for the dreaming body, the dreaming world is a real world. So there is something called a dreaming consciousness. And we have also experienced that we have something called dreamless consciousness too. Many times we have seen this, that when we woke up after our sleep, we say that I had a sound sleep. We may share with our family or friends that you had a soundless sleep the other day. And why soundless sleep? Because there were no dreams, there was no activity, the mind was completely silent, the mind was totally absent, the mind recorded no activity. and you felt a kind of dreamless sleep, and it was nourishing. But then the mind later on, when we are wakeful, when we wake up, the mind realizes that there was this dreamless state of consciousness. So there are these three bodies. One is the waking body, and the waking consciousness. And then there is a dreaming body and the dreaming consciousness. And there is something called dreamless body, where there are no dreams, and there is a dreamless consciousness. So this Mandukya Upanishad talks about these three, that the individual consciousness has to pass through the experiences of these three kinds of bodies. The waking consciousness is gross, and the dreaming consciousness is subtle compared to the waking consciousness, and the dreamless consciousness is further subtler compared to the waking consciousness and the dreaming consciousness. And finally, the Mandukya Upanishad talks about the fourth body called the awakened body and the awakened consciousness. It just terms that consciousness as fourth, or it just says Turyam, which literally means, a Sanskrit word, Turyam literally means the fourth. So it does not really give it any kind of name to that consciousness, which we are actually calling it as a pure consciousness, because there are no divisions there. It's something like, there is this room, and let's say if it is lit somewhere a little bit here, and then let's say if we bring a bigger lamp, and let's say a bigger illumination has been brought in, and let's think that is a point where the whole room is illuminated and there are absolutely no dark corners anywhere. That complete illumination without any divisions is what is termed as the fourth, or the Turyam, or the pure consciousness. Now the experience of that pure consciousness is what is called awareness. So as we move on this journey of consciousness, there are these two things, the witness. So on the path of spirituality, just like in contrast to science, there was observer and there was an observed thing. So there was an observer and the object being observed. In the same way, here there is a witness and the thing being witnessed. And what things are being witnessed? All these experiences of a dreaming consciousness, a waking consciousness, and a dreamless consciousness. And as we move on this path, so there is this observer and the observed thing. But in this approach of consciousness, in this process as a witness is still an event happening in time. Why it is still an event happening in time? Because there are these two things and separated by some kind of distance. So there is a space, there is this object, there is this observer who is a witness, and there is a distance between these two things, the observer and the observed thing, the witness and the thing being witnessed, right? So there is a time. So consciousness is an activity that is done in order to know about that observed thing, and there is a time, there is a distance between the two. Now as we approach on this path, a point comes that the distance between the observer and the observed phenomenon comes closer and closer. So there are these two things, the seer and the seen, the drashta and the srashti. I mean the one who is looking at the creation is what is called the drashta, and srashti is the source of creation itself. Call it a creator. So this distance gets closer and closer, and a point comes that the witness dissolves in the witnessing thing. And that witnessing thing is what is called the ultimate reality. You call it absolute reality, you call it ultimate reality, where time ceases, the space has no meaning, and this duality disappears, and this so called observer becomes that reality itself. And that experience is what is called awareness. So, in awareness, we are not becoming aware of something. Yes, in consciousness, we are becoming conscious of something. It can be some experience. We talked about these four paradigms, these four types of consciousness, four types of bodies: the waking body, the dreaming body, the dreamless body, and then awakened body. So we have these four consciousness. In that fourth, what we call the Turium, the observer, the so-called witness, gets dissolved in the ultimate reality, the one that is being witnessed. And only that reality remains behind. And the witness has no meaning. That is the last event that is happening. And that gives an illumination of timelessness. And that gives us that insight of oneness. That gives us that insight of unification. So in yoga, we say union with the ultimate, union with the divine, union with the ultimate reality, the reality that is already there. It is not created by us. So this so-called mind acts as a medium of duality. So because of the presence of this mind in all these various kinds of experiences, we experience this duality, we experience this separation of, so there is a distance between the witness as me, as you and me, and the thing, and the various events, various things, various experiences are being witnessed. And there is a gap, there is a distance. And this final event that we are talking about, a timeless event, because time ceases, the space has no meaning, because this duality is already frozen. The witness has dissolved in the reality being witnessed. So that point is a point of unification. In yoga, we call union. There is already a union. We are already connected. We are already united. But when we started this journey, we had no idea of this interconnectedness. We had no idea of this union. Why? Because there was this separation. And who brought in this separation? The separation was because of the presence of the mind. Mind acts as a medium of duality. So these are the basic differences between these 4-5 words, which we often misunderstand them. In mundane life, we use them as synonymous. We use alertness, awareness, mindfulness, watchfulness, observer. We use all of them as synonymously. It is okay in our mundane day-to-day life to use them as synonymous, is all okay. But as we move into these spatial fields called science and spirituality, we have to understand those technical differences so that it helps us to understand them better. But lastly, these words are just words. So don't go by these words, these words called consciousness or awareness. These are just words. So unless we bring in our own consciousness closer to that activity, these words become meaningless. Now, what do I mean? What do I really mean by that is, the word apple is not the fruit apple. So if we just use that word as apple, it really has no meaning unless we know that fruit, unless we know the taste of that fruit, unless we cut that fruit and eat ourselves. So on the path of spirituality, we are really talking about ultimately of that living experience. to give, let's say, an example, let's say I have no idea about what the sunrise is, and I come across of a book that talks about sunrise. So there are many pages, there are many chapters, and all these are explained in very beautifully in different ways. But I have really no idea what sunrise is. One day I wake up early in the morning, and before the sunrise, I walk for a distance and see the sunrise myself. Now that becomes a living experience. Now in words, you call it sunrise or you call it by some other name. In the past, there was no English language. There was no this language. So there was no word called consciousness. There was no word called awareness. If let us say Sanskrit was the oldest language, there were these words chitta, chaitanya. Now these words were actually what is meant by that pure consciousness. Then this question arises, is in awareness there is no consciousness? No, there is. Consciousness is an experience. So awareness means the experience of that pure consciousness. So in the lower realm of things, we had those differences. So there were pluralities of experiences. And as we went up the value chain, at the highest point, there was this highest value. And what was the highest value? All divisions are frozen. And the witness sees itself, that ultimate reality. So these are the, I just thought I should share with you what do these 4, 5, 6 words do really mean, because they create a kind of confusion in our minds when we come across these words in science and in our mundane day-to-day life, and very specifically in the world of spirituality. You might have come across of many swamis, many so-called gurus talking about these words. I just thought of myself from my own insight, wanted to share this distinction. I hope this video was of some use. Thank you, friends. Thank you so much. Thank you for watching.